So, when talking about immigration, most specifically in the US, the European case is always portrayed as the great American story of how America came together. We always hear about Ellis Island and all these people coming together and forming America as this sort of salad bowl. But in only presenting this side of America's immigration history, it helps to obscure the ways in which white supremacy works. Because, yet again, the East Coast story on immigration on Ellis Island shows this welcoming America that took those who sought for freedom and happiness. But when moving a little bit more to the West Coast, we find ourselves with the stories of Angel Island and this other side of American immigration, which is people who came from Asia. And we find this completely different story compared to the East, in which we see a lot of repression and exclusion, and most specifically of racism. And really comparing this narrative between European and Asian immigrants, we can really see the stark differences in numbers and most especially the stories.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, two-thirds of them American citizens, one-third aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous, but no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
And taking in fact the context of the time, one would think that Germans, Italians, and Japanese would be treated the same, because at the end of the day, all of them were a threat to national security. Yet again, the first two groups, Germans and Italians, were spared the dignity of ongoing mass incarceration, losing their liberty and all the things they had worked so hard for. So really, Executive Order 9066 was especially targeting people of Japanese descent. And in seeing this, we see something very, very stark about Americans' history with xenophobia, and especially to people who are not white. Because looking at the history of America regarding Asian people, not specifically Japanese people, but people from Asia, we see that law had never been on their side. They couldn't own land. Women were seen as mere sexual objects, and they were only brought to America to be prostitutes. And despite their efforts to deconstruct themselves and be more Western, they were never accepted in a place where hostility surrounded them. Because compared to Germans and Italians, they were not white. They didn't have that privilege. So by 1942, mass incarceration of about 120,000 Japanese Americans, that is very important to say, two-thirds of them were American citizens. The role, and it's talked a lot about in political science, one of the main roles of the state is protecting your citizens, protecting the rights of your citizens. And yet again, despite them being American citizens, they were incarcerated, and the right to freedom was broken. They stood for a country that had already and would keep letting them down. And by 1943, their loyalty was questioned. And this is something that has to do with a lot of philosophy and stuff. What is to be loyal? If it be something that can bend with every wind, what is to be loyal, how to prove that you were loyal. Isn't it enough that they had to sell their properties? Isn't it enough that they're living in these horrible conditions? Isn't it enough that they have erased a big part of their identity? Isn't it enough that they had to accept primarily American values and American customs in order to fit in, to prove that they were American? What is to be loyal to America? So one would think that things would change from there, that the xenophobia would be mayhaps a little less, that Americans would be more eager and more open, and they would have changed. But this is a problem. Things haven't quite changed. Because you see, when the government legitimates exclusion, that gives people a signal. It gives them a license to hate. And it's really something that has happened really throughout this pandemic and COVID. Actions like the one of President Mr. Trump, of calling it a Chinese virus and blaming Asians for all of this, really gave most Americans a signal and this license to hate on them and to commit hate crimes, which is not okay.